Okay, today we have 4 different topics. One is the monthly and annual uploads. We want to go over a little bit of information on that since that is changing. The second would be the ARR schedules and common questions that we've been receiving on that. And then the reporting for grants to local businesses under the COVID grants, and then also a CARES refresher. So we want to go through all of that information today. The monthly uploads, we talked back in, I think it was November, about that and the changes that are going to be made. And those changes started with the December 2020 upload information that was due February 15th. For December 2020 and thereafter, we're going to need a bank reconcilement, bank statements, an outstanding checklist, approved board minutes, and a funds ledger. Those are the 5 things now that are required to be uploaded on a monthly basis. The bank statements and the outstanding checklist are new. If you happen to have uploads that have not been completed for the prior July 2018 to November 2020, then those are the things that are listed that are due for those time periods. If you do have any other questions on that, you can go to our presentation and training materials for November 2020, and we have an hour-long session on that, or a half-hour session on that, and a video. Okay, now in the bank reconciliation, the bank statement and outstanding checklist, I just wanted to kind of go through what those are and what we're expecting there. These 3 items can be entered in as one document if you have them all in one document. If you have them in 3 documents, then it can be entered in 3 documents or however many you want. Whatever is easiest for you. These 3 things are all uploaded in the same section. So you can enter as many documents as you want, or you can enter just one that has all of this information. So for the bank reconciliation, we have an example format here for you with your bank balance plus deposits in transit, minus outstanding checks, and then plus or minus some other outstanding reconciling items to come down to your ledger balance. Your bank statement is just the document you receive each month from the bank, and that's going to show, of course, your beginning balance, your deposits, and checks that have cleared and other activity in your ending balance. And you're supposed to include all pages that you receive in your bank statement, including check images. And then the outstanding checklist is just a list of checks that have been written but have not yet cleared the bank. And you're going to show your check number, your check amount, and your total there. You do need to upload this information for each bank account. And as I said earlier, you can upload multiple documents if you need to. The approved board minutes, nothing has really changed in that area. We do require board minutes for all boards or commissions that could have a financial impact. And we tried to define financial impact for you there as a board that approves expenditures or applies for grants or approves or recommends the issuance of debt, receives and opens sealed bids or awards contracts, approves and signs contracts, or approves change orders, or anything really that's similar to that. That would be a board or commission that has a financial impact. And then we tried to list examples of those boards to the right, that being your city and town council, a redevelopment commission if you have one, or an economic development commission if you have a park board or a public works board, and so forth. All of those boards would be considered ones that have a financial impact. The monthly funds ledger, nothing is new here either. That is just the report that shows a summary of the beginning balance and the total receipts and the total disbursements and the ending balance for each fund for each month. Now, if you have hand-posted records, we do have a manual records template available for you, and I've shown that to you here on the right. You can make that up yourself in Excel, or you can get our template off of the out of the user guide. If you just search for manual records template, it'll come up. Hand-posted records can use that, or you can scan or upload a photo. If you've computerized records, we do prefer an Excel file if that's possible. Here's the due dates for the monthly uploads. You'll notice they're due about 6 weeks after the month end, and December files were due on February 15th. And that was the beginning of the new uploads. So on to the annual uploads. Please don't forget about these. These also are due on March 1st. And for computerized accounting systems, this is the information that you'll need to give us. The year-end investment statements, a detail of receipts, a detail of disbursements, the current year salary ordinance and amendments, an annual vendor history report, the annual funds ledger, and that's new, the annual payroll history report, also new, and the court trust subsidiary detail, which is new. Now, all of these items are specifically discussed in the user guide with a listing of everything that's needed for each one of these items. So if you have any questions on that, we would recommend that you go to the user guide and take a look at that. Also, in the November training that we did, we went through each item individually and talked about that. So you can go back and look at that November training if you would like to. If you have hand-posted records, you don't have to complete all of this information. You can see that we have a line through detail of receipts and disbursements, the annual vendor history report, and the annual payroll history report. Those are ones that are not required for hand-posted records, but the other ones are required. There is also an option for an Excel data capture for annual uploads, and that would be for your detail of receipts and detail of disbursement reports. You would have to check with your software vendor to see if that's available to you, but if it is, you are certainly welcome to take that option. And then we have a listing here for the receipts and for the disbursements, what's needed for each one of those, if you choose to do this data capture. So the annual uploads due date is March 1st. Again, this is in the engagement uploads section, not in the annual financial report like it was years ago. So please don't forget to do these. We'd really appreciate having those in on time. Okay, so that was it for the monthly and annual uploads. I'll move along to the annual financial report and gateway. I know that's what's on everybody's mind right now. It's required by Indiana Code 51114 and is due 60 days after year end, which is March 1st. So that deadline is on the horizon. We know that you've all been working very hard on that. We can tell because we've received a lot of great questions on it. So for the next few minutes, what we would like to do is to go through the schedules and talk a little bit about each one, and then some of the questions that we've been receiving go through. I'm hoping that that will be helpful to you. A couple of overall things to remember when you're doing the AFR. Please use Chrome or Firefox. If you use Internet Explorer, then all of the data entry boxes do not show up and you'll keep getting submission errors and warnings that way. So please use Chrome or Firefox. The other thing kind of overall is that if you see a data entry cell that says required, I think it's usually in blue, then you have to enter something in that cell, even if it's a 0. So make sure you complete all of those, or you'll get a warning or an error that says that your schedule is not complete. It's just a couple simple things, but if you're not aware of it, then just creates a lot of aggravation. Okay, so the AFR schedules. The schedules are generated based on responses to the unit questions. I have unit questions in capitalized there because I think on the original materials that were sent out or on the website says risk assessment questions, and that's incorrect. They are based on responses to the unit questions on the AFR. So how you answer those questions is going to depend on which schedules are generated. For example, if you say, yes, we have capital assets, then you're going to get a capital asset schedule to complete. If you say we have no debt, then you're not going to get a debt schedule to complete. So if you, as you're going through the annual report, if there's a schedule that's there for you to complete and you think, well, wait a minute, I don't have any of this information, I don't need to complete this schedule, go back to your unit questions and answer no for that particular schedule. And vice versa, if you think that you should be completing a schedule that is not showing up on the AFR, go back and take a look at your unit questions and see how you answered that question. Each schedule has its own question. So on the capital assets schedule, you're going to report your asset amounts as of December 31st, and you want to make sure your capital asset ledger is updated through year end. You will break out your capital assets by activity, so you'll have your governmental activities assets, and then if you have a utility, then you would have your utility assets listed separately in a separate section. The beginning balance does roll over from the prior year, and then you're going to need to put in additions and reductions to arrive at your ending balance. Just as a couple of examples on how to complete this, if your capitalization threshold is $5,000 and you buy a $30,000 snowplow, then that snowplow is going to be put on under machinery and equipment as an addition for $30,000, which is the amount you paid, which is also called the historical cost. And that's the basis of the schedule, is historical cost. If you instead didn't buy a snow plow, but you bought a snow blower for $1,500 and your capitalization threshold is $5,000, then you would not put it on this schedule because it's below that $5,000 amount. You'll keep track of it separately in another way as your council has determined this schedule, because it's under that $5,000 threshold. Now, another question we get, let's say you bought a snowplow for $30,000 last year, in 2019, and it's on your machinery and equipment list, and in 2020 you sell it for $25,000. When you record that reduction, you're going to take it off of your schedule at $30,000, even though you only got $25,000 for it. This schedule is concerned with historical cost, not the amount that you sold it for. So just kind of keep that in mind too as you go through. We've also had a lot of questions on how to handle previous errors. We're all trying to go through, everybody's trying to get their capital asset schedule to be correct in contemplation of the enhanced regulatory basis of accounting note. So as you're working through that, you're likely to find that there are some errors. The best way to handle that is to show those items. Let's say you've got some items that should have been removed years ago, or you've got some other items that should be on there. For those items that should have been removed years ago, as a reduction in the year that you make the correction, and then keep a list of those. And also those items that should have been on your list from years ago that are not, you're going to just show those as an addition in the year you make the correction, and then just keep a list of those. Now, we have had some people say they're just adjusting the beginning balance, and you can do that. Just make sure that you have a reconciliation between the ending balance of the previous year and the beginning balance of the current year. And just keep all of that available for our field examiners and when they come in to do the next audit. You'll notice here, like in land and additions and reductions, we have zeros in those boxes. There was no changes to land for this unit actually that was 2019. And that's what I was talking about, those required cells. It probably said required in there, so you have to enter something and put a 0 in there. This is just for your convenience. In order to prepare for the annual financial report, you can use the following checklist as guidance. And these are just the things that you're going to need and have documented, and you can use those for audit as well. So you need to make sure you have your capitalization policy so you know what goes on your schedule. You have to maintain your capital asset ledger because that should correspond directly to your schedule. and just confirm and identify additions and reductions and your activities in major classes so that you have all of that information available for you when you prepare the AFR. Just makes it go a little easier. On the debt schedule, we don't get too many questions on the debt schedule, but that is reporting debt as of December 31st. You do have to have your debt classification, like is it a revenue bond or a general obligation bond or something else, and a description of the debt, what it's for, and then your ending principal balance at 12/31, and then the principal and interest due the following year. This again is just another checklist if you like checklists on what you can gather to prepare for the annual financial report. The lease schedule, likewise, we don't get too many questions on the lease schedule. You do have to have the lessor name and again a description or purpose, the annual lease payment, and the lease beginning and ending date. And that's really all there is to that. So again, we don't get too many questions on that, but if you would, again, like a checklist, I have a checklist here on this slide. The last 2 points on here, complete the DLGF debt management report information and gateway. That is separate from our lease schedule. It's very important that that be completed and updated, not just from a compliance aspect, but also from a financial statement note aspect, because we do pull information from that debt management report for you so that you can have a complete note on debt. So please do keep that up as well. Accounts receivable and accounts payable, you're going to report those both as of December 31st. We don't get a lot of questions on this table, but we do see that there are a lot of AFRs that don't have this completed correctly. Accounts payable is just amounts for goods or services that your unit has received in 2020 but not paid for until 2021. An example would be claims or invoices. Let's say you went to the office supply store in December and got some supplies, but you're not paying for that until January. That would be an example of an accounts payable. A way to flag these might be in December to look for bills coming in that are dated in 2020, but you know they won't be paid for until 2021. Another way is to look at claims that were paid in January and February and see if any of them were for purchases that were made in December. Accounts receivable, you're probably a little more familiar with, especially if you have a utility. Accounts receivables are amounts that are owed to your unit as of December 31, but they have not been received by year end yet. The best example, again, is utility fees that have been billed to customers but are still unpaid at the end of the year. And hopefully, if you have a computerized system, it will generate this information for you. Okay, the next section that I want to talk about on the annual financial report is interfund transfers. And I think this is one of the most frequent questions we get. So we want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time here. The transfer schedule will show up in the unit question section. Actually, unit question 12, did your unit make interfund transfers during the year? And in this case, I'm answering yes to that question. So because I've answered yes, I have two different things to do. I have to complete the transfer schedule that's going to show up in the schedules section. And I also have to enter those transfers in the financial data by fund section for each fund. So we're just going to go through an example here. The town of Toddville had the following transfers in 2020. We had a transfer from general to rainy day of $132,000. We had a transfer from MVH to community crossings of $300,000. And we had a transfer from LRS to community crossings of $10,000. So I'm going to go, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the financial data by fund section for those funds, and I'm going to enter that information. So in other receipts for rainy day fund, you can see I have a transfer $2,000. And in the other disbursements from the general fund, I have a transfer out of $132,000. It's important that your transfers in and your transfers out agree. Okay, now with regard to the transfers to the Community Crossings grant, in the Community Crossings grant other receipts, I have $310,000 that has come in as a transfer in. Okay, and then other disbursements for MVH, I have my transfer out of $300,000. And then I'm going to go to LRS, and I should have put that in a transfer out, but I didn't. I put it in other disbursements. I hope you can see that down there of $10,000. Okay. So when I go to review my submission and try to submit, I'm going to get a warning about that. First of all, it's going to say my transfers don't balance. The sum of all transfer receipts does not equal the sum of all transfer disbursements. And it says for help in balancing transfers, I want to generate the transfers report on the outputs menu. And then my second set of warnings is my transfer schedule. I haven't done anything with my transfer schedule. I forgot. So, and it appears that entries are missing. So it wants me to take a look at that. But first, I'm going to deal with the transfers that do not balance. If you go to main menu and system functions, and then annual report outputs, you'll see a section for transfers, and you're going to click on that. And when you do, it's going to give you a report of the transfers that you entered in the financial data by fund section. And you can see I'm out of balance here. I have transfers out of $432,000 and of $442,000. So that $10,000 from LRS, I didn't get recorded. So now I need to go back and I need to make a change. So I'll go back and I still have the $310,000 coming into Community Crossings and the $300,000 coming out of MVH. But now I have changed and done a transfer out in other disbursements for LRS. Because remember, your transfers in and your transfers out have to agree. Your gateway does not like that. So now I'm going to go back to that report. I'm going to check it. In my LRS, $10,000 is in there as a transfer out, and now my transfers out and my transfers in both balance at $442,000. So that makes me happy. Back to my submission warnings, and my transfers do not balance. That's not there anymore. But now I still have this transfer schedule where an entry appears to be missing. So, because of what I said earlier, we know now we have to go back in and complete that transfer schedule. Because again, Unit 12 requires that I complete that schedule because I answered yes there. So the transfer schedule is pretty easy to complete. In that transfer from and transfer to, those are drop-down menus with all of your funds listed. So you just have to select the fund it went from and the fund it went to, and then you do have to enter the amount. So I've got all of mine there. I've got my general to rainy day of $132,000. My LRS to Community Crossings of 10, and my MVH to Community Crossings of 300. And it's important that the transfer schedule information agree with what you've entered in the financial data by fund section. If it doesn't agree, for example, if I would have maybe left off the MVH 300,000, then it's going to warning and say that there's an entry that appears to be missing. So you'll want to make sure that those do agree. All right, I catch up in my notes here. The next schedule that I have to talk about is the financial assistance to non-governmental entities. There's nothing that's changed here. You all are doing a great job with, filling out the information to where your city or town has provided aid to these not-for-profit units. But this year we have something different. We have those that are going to local businesses because of the COVID grants that your cities or towns may be giving out to local businesses. And those do need to be put on this form. I gave an example here of Susan's Coffee Shop in Toddville. Toddville gave Susan's Coffee Shop a grant of $1,000, and the type of business is a for-profit corporation. So you'll need to complete that for the local business grants that you have given because of the COVID situation that we're in. And those local business grants, Board of Accounts did issue a memo on March 31st of 2020 called Assistance During COVID. If you have any questions about that or what was required there, you can go back and look at that memo. Now you'll remember that in the Cities and Towns Bulletin in September 2016, you're required to notify those non-governmental entities that are required to notify or that are required to file an E1 with our agency. And that is true for all not-for-profit non-governmental entities. However, our office has made the determination that this does not apply to COVID grants to local for-profit businesses. So you are not required to tell them, and they are not required to file an E1. So that's new this year. I wanted to make sure you all knew that because there's been some confusion on that. Okay, the federal grant schedule. These are the categories of information required on the grant schedule. Note that this is for federal grants only, and all of your CARES money is going to be shown on this schedule. If you have any questions about what these categories mean, they are all defined in the user guide. You can just type in grant schedule and go down and it will give you a description for each one. Most of the questions that we've had on this revolve around the CARES money, so I'm going to talk about that for just a little bit. The most common we have is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That's the money that's coming through IFA. So there's that CFDA number for you. And then the Provider Relief Fund, that's that Medical Provider Relief Fund advance grant from HHS. And that's the CFDA 93.498. Those are the two most common ones we have. However, if you have others that you're not sure what their CFDA number is, you can go to beta.sam.gov and you can look those up. And we do have a slide here that for CDBG special purpose grants or the Airport Improvement Program, we have those CFDA numbers highlighted here because those are also common. But if you go to beta.sam.gov, this is what it looks like on the home page. And you can do a search by either grant name or grant number. So I've done both here. I searched for Coronavirus Relief Fund, and you could just do coronavirus, I think. And then I also searched by CFDA number 21.019. And with either one of those searches, it comes up like this with the Coronavirus Relief Fund with the CFDA number, the type of assistance that it is, the department or agency that's the grantor agency, and a description there. So that should give you the information that you need to complete your grant schedule. On the Board of Accounts grant schedule, this is from a prior presentation that we did. Todd put this schedule together to show you what it would look like for the CARES Grant Fund with the federal project name of Coronavirus Relief Fund, the federal agency being the Department of Treasury, and the pass-through being the Indiana Finance Authority with the CFDA number there, the award name and the grant type. And then here's the rest of that schedule with the local fund number. Here Todd has 150 CARES Grant Fund. You might have a different number, but it should be between 150 and 175. So you can see an example of how that's going to look on the grant schedule. It would for the Provider Relief Fund as well. Now OPEB, surprisingly, we haven't had too many questions on OPEB this year. We're kind of happy about that because last year there were a lot of questions on OPEB. We do have a 1-hour presentation recording available on this subject and how to complete the schedule and what OPEB is. That's under presentation and training materials from the Clerk Treasurer's Fall Meeting of 2020. So if you have questions about OPEB, we would encourage you to review that video. and the meeting materials. OPEB is just other post-employment benefits. That's paid, of course, after employment. And it would include such things like death benefits or life insurance or disability or long-term care. It does not include pensions, termination of benefits, or termination payments for sick leave, and it is not COBRA. And again, watch that video presentation, take a look at those meeting materials. Also take a look in the user guide. There's a lot of detail in that as well for you to look at as you complete the OPEB section. Likewise, pensions, we haven't had too many questions on this year. You are required to complete the pension section. All units are. Pensions would not include deferred compensation plans like Hoosier Start or 457 or 401A plans. And it's nice on the schedule. It indicates whether your unit offers any of the pension plans to your employees, and it's going to have the ones that are statutorily applicable to your unit, like PERF or the Police Pension Fund or the 1977 Police and Firefighters Fund and so forth. You can just check those boxes, and if that's all that you offer, then you can be done with that form. And that makes it pretty easy. If you have another pension plan that you offer, then you'll have to answer yes to question number 2, and then there will be some information for you to complete on that. Okay, and on the AFR, we just have some other common questions that we need to, or would like to at least address here for the moment. And those are just how to record your interest, how to change your investment balances, correction of errors on a prior AFR, what to do with your SRF transactions, and how to handle redevelopment authorities. Not redevelopment commissions, but redevelopment authorities. So the recording of investments, the recording of interest on investments is in other receipts. It's that second line down, earnings on investments and deposits. So you're going to record the interest in the financial data by fund section for the fund that receives the interest. And that will either be the general fund or another fund that has been designated by council. When you enter your earnings on investments and deposits, that is not going to change your ending investment balance. When you record the purchase or sale of an investment, that is going to change the ending investment balance. So if you have a sale of investments, that's going to reduce the ending balance of investments, and that's automatically calculated in Gateway. So if you don't know why it changed, it's because you've entered something in the sale of investments. And likewise, or similarly, the purchase of investments is going to increase the ending balance of investments. And again, that's an automatic calculation. So if your ending balance for investments has changed and you don't know why, or you don't think that's right, go back and review these entries for purchases and sales and see if you can figure out where the error might have occurred that way. Some of you have discovered that you've made an error on a prior year's annual financial report and you want to know if you can go in and change that. And the answer to that question is yes, you can, as long as that year has not been audited. So you'll go to, on the AFR, you'll go to the main menu, Systems Functions section, and you'll just unsubmit the report. Where it says Submit Now, it'll say Unsubmit. So you can unsubmit the report, you can make whatever corrections you need to make, and then you can resubmit that prior year report. Make sure you resubmit it and don't leave it unsubmitted. And then you can do that until that year is locked for editing by the Board of Accounts because we've audited that year. After it's been audited, you can't go back in and change that information. SRF transactions, you do need to include that activity in your ledger and in the AFR. Those, even though it's handled by another bank like the Bank of New York, those are still your city or town transactions, so you'll need to include those. And then redevelopment authorities, those are not redevelopment commissions. Redevelopment commission is a department of your city or town. A redevelopment authority is a separate entity in the statutes. And so that needs to be reported separately and not on the city or town AFR. It gets an AFR all of its own. So please contact us if you have a redevelopment authority that needs to be set up separately in Gateway. Okay, well, that's all I had on the AFR and the monthly and annual uploads and those subjects. Right now, we would like to do a CARES refresher and talk about some of the problems that, it's not really problems, but some of the timing differences. You may have received reimbursement in 2021 for costs in 2020. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on here. You remember last year we issued lots of memorandums on how to account for COVID funds and how to account for CARES funds. I've listed those major ones there for you. The one that deals with the money from IFA is State Examiner Directive 2020-3, and that's where we'll spend most of our time here in this next section. Just in general, when you account for COVID grants, any assistance that you receive for a national or state emergency is going to be receipted into a separate fund. We're not going to take audit exception and establish that fund without the adoption of an ordinance. But you should establish a separate fund for each separately identified assistance provided. We do have fund number ranges for you of 150 to 175, with the exception of the HHS grant for medical provider relief, that is Fund 264. Now, grants administered through the IFA have specific prescribed accounting procedures in the directive. So we want to make sure we don't forget that. They're different. It's different. All related expenditure records, like accounts payable vouchers, minutes, correspondence, contracts, and so forth, do have to be maintained in a separate file for future audits as required by federal and state agencies of COVID funds. For each grant, it's important that you track every dollar dispersed for COVID-related expenses and maintain your supporting documentation for those expenses. It's also important to remember that sufficient internal controls over all transactions be in place, having separate funds, maintaining your records, having detailed comments that provide audit trails and appropriate approval forth are all part of a good internal control system for grants. Now, State Examiner Directive 2020-3 deals specifically with the Coronavirus Relief Fund that's been administered through the IFA, and it has prescribed accounting procedures to account for public health and safety payroll costs, and then other permitted costs that are not public health and safety costs. So we're going to go through that a little bit in terms of what happens when you receive money in 2021 for something that happened in 2020. Okay, so the State Examiner Directive says a separate CARES grant has to be established. The directive the authority to create that separate grant fund, so you do not need an ordinance, or at least Board of Accounts is not requiring you to have an ordinance. And again, you would use a fund number between 150 and 175. All money received from the Coronavirus Relief Fund through IFA must be deposited into a separate CARES grant fund. Now, as far as accounting for reimbursement received in 2021 for 2020 costs, you remember for public health and safety payroll costs, your council had a couple of options. One was they could adopt an ordinance or resolution in accordance with the directive to transfer that money to the general fund. And the other one was where they didn't adopt an ordinance. So we'll go through the situation where the council has adopted an ordinance first. You're going to receipt that money into the CARES grant fund, and then you'll file a claim against the CARES grant fund in favor of the general fund. And then you'll transfer money from the separate CARES grant fund into the general fund cash balance, and then council can appropriate that whenever they deem that to be necessary, but it can't be spent without appropriation. The CARES grant fund balance will then be zero, and there'll be no money remaining in that fund for expenditure. Really, nothing changed with that, whether it's was received in 2021 for 2020 cost because of that ordinance. So we'll just go through an example. A city had public health and safety payroll costs for the period of March 1 to September 30th, totaling $750,000 that was paid out of two funds, the general fund and the public safety lit fund. Of that amount, $650,000 was paid out of the general fund appropriations under salaries for $475,000, overtime $25,000, and benefits of $150,000. The remaining $100,000 was paid out of public safety lit from appropriations for salaries $75,000, overtime of $15,000, and benefits of $10,000. The city received the reimbursement from IFA in January of 2021 for the total amount paid of $750,000. So here's how that's going to play out then. Council had previously adopted that ordinance. The city receipts the reimbursement into the separate CARES fund. Council approves a claim to pay the general fund $750,000. Council then appropriates the $750,000 in the general fund when they deem that necessary, following the normal appropriation process. And then the CARES grant fund is going to have a zero balance. Okay, so we're still on public health and safety payroll costs, but what happens when council has not adopted that ordinance that's talked about in Directive 2020-3? We're still going to receive the reimbursement from IFA into the separate CARES grant fund. And then you'll file a claim against the CARES grant fund in favor of the fund which originally incurred the expense. And then you're going to transfer the money from the CARES grant fund to the unappropriated cash balance of the fund which originally incurred the expense. Then council can appropriate that as they deem necessary. This is treated very similarly to how you correct an error from a prior year. The CARES grant fund balance will be zero and no money will remain in that CARES grant fund. So we'll go over an example of that. This is the same scenario we had earlier, so I won't read through all of that. City received the reimbursement from IFA in January of 2021 for the total amount paid of $750,000, and remembering that there is no ordinance under 2020-3. The city goes ahead and receipts the reimbursement into the separate CARES fund, and then council approves a claim to transfer $650,000 to general fund and $100,000 to the lit public safety fund. And that's because the council did not have an ordinance transferring it all to the general fund. Council is then going to appropriate the $650,000 in the general fund and $100,000 in the lit public safety fund when deemed that necessary, following the normal appropriation procedures, but the money cannot be spent without appropriation. And then the CARES grant fund will have a zero balance. So again, this is being treated much like a correction of error from a prior year. Okay, also for CARES money, you may have submitted reimbursement requests for other permitted costs. And how do you account for reimbursement received in 2021 for those costs that you incurred in 2020? Because we had originally had the reversal of the expense and so forth, and that, that doesn't work when you're in a different budget year. So you're going to receive the reimbursement from IFA into a separate CARES grant fund. Then you'll file a claim against a separate CARES grant fund in favor of the fund which originally incurred the cost. And then you'll transfer the money from the separate CARES fund to the unappropriated cash balance of the fund which originally incurred the expense for appropriation by council as they deem necessary. Again, this is very similar to the procedure used to correct an error from a prior year. The CARES grant fund balance will be zero, and then no money will remain in the CARES grant fund for expenditure. So we'll go through an example. I have a couple of examples depending on the framework that was used per 2020-3. So let's say in 2020, the town purchased equipment to hold virtual public meetings in the amount of $5,000. The original expense is paid out of the Riverboat Fund. In 2020, the town submitted a reimbursement request to IFA, and they received their $5,000 in 2021. We're still going to receive the reimbursement into the separate CARES grant fund, which will show a balance now of $5,000. Then you're going to file a claim against the CARES grant fund in favor of the Riverboat Fund, because that fund originally incurred the cost for the $5,000. The town is then going to post the $5,000 disbursement to the separate CARES grant fund with a reference to the original claim and supporting documentation, bringing the balance of the fund to zero. The town will receive $5,000 into the unappropriated cash balance of the Riverboat Fund, and that cannot be spent without appropriation. And then the balance of the CARES grant fund will be zero. And then no money will remain in that CARES grant fund for expenditure. Now, under Framework 2, that was in the case where if you submitted a reimbursement request to IFA on unpaid invoices or POs, which IFA was allowing, you would still receive money into the IFA, into the separate CARES grant fund, and then you would pay your vendor directly from the CARES grant fund in that case. You could only pay for costs that were included in the request to IFA and directly tied to the amount provided by IFA. And then any difference between the amount paid to the vendor and the amount provided by IFA had to be returned to IFA. And your CARES grant fund then would be zero and no money would remain. So I'll go through an example on that Framework 2. Actually, I think I have 2 examples. In this first example, in 2020, a city ordered emergency radios for $10,000 and submitted the reimbursement request to IFA before the payment was made for the radios. In 2021, IFA reimburses the $10,000 to the city, and the city receipts that into the separate CARES grant fund, which now has a $10,000 balance. In 2021, the town purchases the $10,000 of equipment and submits a claim against the CARES fund directly. These expenditures must match the application to IFA for the reimbursement. And then the CARES grant fund is zero and no money remains. Now in the second example I have, this again is based on reimbursement being received for a purchase not yet made. In 2020, the city ordered emergency radios for $10,000 and submitted the reimbursement request to IFA before payment was made on the radios. IFA reimbursed the $10,000 to the city before payment was made on the radios. City receives the money into the separate CARES grant fund, which now has a $10,000 balance. The town purchases only $8,000 of equipment directly from the CARES fund in 2021, and the type of equipment matched the description on the application to IFA. Since the city decided to purchase fewer radios, the CARES fund had a balance left of $2,000. That $2,000 has to be returned to IFA, bringing the balance of the fund to zero. Okay, so I hope the CARES refresher helped. I'm sure we'll be talking more about that in the second hour. Just to kind of wind up this first hour here, we do have some upcoming training opportunities. The March ILMCT Institute and Academy is March 15th to the 18th. That is virtual. We're going to be attending that. We hope you will be too. April and May we'll have some monthly meetings again, but we haven't quite nailed that down. So we will give a announcement of that in the March bulletin and maybe through the eGov delivery system. And then in June will be the June School in Evansville, June 7th to the 10th. And as far as I know, that's still in person. I hope it is. It'd be nice to see everybody again. But other than that, that's all I have. Oh, and one other thing, keep in mind if you would like to make an appointment with us, to have a WebEx meeting, please feel free to ask us about that. We have set aside Thursday mornings specifically for that if somebody would a meeting. So if you would like that, instead of waiting for us to call you back or waiting on an email, if you'd like to just set an appointment, please feel free to do that. In the subject line, it would be helpful if you would put appointment request or meeting request so that we can get to that. We do get a lot of emails every day, so sometimes we have to, sift through those to see if somebody wants a meeting. So we would appreciate that. Other than that, now I think we can open it up. Oh, here's our contact information. Please feel free to contact us, of course, anytime at that information. And we can now open it up for questions.